A fellow YouTuber recently reached out to me and asked if I'd be willing to help out the Beads of Courage charity. I asked how it works, and he explained that it's a charity geared towards encouraging and lifting the spirits of children that are battling illnesses. Whether the child is undergoing surgery, having a radiation treatment, or any number of other procedures, it can be pretty scary for them. It's at these times that the nursing staff gives the child a bead of courage. And as these children look at their collection of beads, they can see how far they've come, and it helps them to stay positive and persevere. After a while, some of these children can amass quite a collection and need a place to store their beads, and that's where us makers come in. So today, I'll be building a box for a child in the Beads of Courage program. Let's get to it. I start off by cutting down a rough sawn piece of ash, which I've had drying at the top of my lumber rack for years. And since this board is about as in shape as I am, I had to shim it up on a sled before running it through the planer. Once it wasn't wobbling any longer, I could add some small cleats to the sled and then work on flattening the top. At first, the planer was just getting the ends of the board, but eventually the top was planed perfectly flat. At that point, I could get rid of the sled, flip the board over, and then flatten the other side. Next step in the milling process was to square up one of the edges over on the joiner. And then with two flat faces and a square edge, I could now resaw the board in half over at the bandsaw. Once I got it apart, I put each of the two sides back through the planer to remove the bandsaw marks and to get them to their final thickness. A couple passes across the table saw, and I can get them each to the right width, and then finish cutting out all four sides of the box at the miter saw. Now it's time for my favorite jig of all time, and that's the one I made to cut out perfect box joints. First thing I do is set the top carriage over to the side and raise the indexing key so that it's in one of the notches in the removable template. Then I line up the pieces to be cut and clamp them into place using the hold downs. And that's it. We're ready to cut some box joints. The way it works is that the indexing key in the back is the exact same width as the saw blade I'm using. So, after each cut, I can nudge the top carriage over and make another cut. Once I've made enough cuts that the carriage can't be moved over anymore, I lift it up and place the indexing key in the next notch in the template. It's super easy and it works great. And you can make all kinds of custom templates for different sizes of box joints. I'm definitely no genius, but every now and then I come up with something that works really well, and this is certainly one of them. Kind of like my wooden underwear idea, which is perfect, except for all the splinters. Testing the fit, and perfect. I first glued up two halves of the box so that I could make sure that they were square. Then, once those were dry, I could glue them both together a little bit more easily than trying to wrangle all four sides at once while worrying about whether it'll be square or not once it's dry. A few hours later, I could pop it out of the clamps and flush up the box joint fingers over at the disc sander. Then, using a rabbiting bit in my router, I could cut in a ledge around the box so that I could drop in a bottom. And since this bit uses a guide bearing, it couldn't quite get all the way into the corners. This means I have a perfect opportunity to show you how awful I am at using a chisel. I cut out a piece for the bottom and tweaked it with a block plane until I snuck up on the perfect fit. And with that, I could glue it in to complete the first part of the box. Now, I wanted to make a very unique looking box, and since I knew this was going to be for kids, I thought, what kid doesn't like cake? Better yet, what kid doesn't like cake with chocolate oozing down the sides? So, my idea is to resaw down some walnut and carve it into shape. To do this, I'll need to set the saw at 45 degrees and miter the edges for the walnut frame. Once I had all the pieces dry fit and clamped into place, I could channel my inner Bob Ross and start drawing some happy little drips around the box. And with all that drawn on there, I could head over to the bandsaw and rough cut it out. I didn't have to worry about being exact here because I knew I could clean things up once I started to shape it. I figured it would be easier to go ahead and glue 3 of the pieces together instead of having to try and line up all 4 sides after I've shaped them. So I put down some painter's tape to keep it from adhering to the box, and I left this to dry for a few hours. And then I could pop it off the box and get it into the vise and ready for shaping. And to do that, I used a sanding bit and a rotary tool and went to town. I formed all the drips and even rounded over a little bit on the back side to give them each a very three-dimensional look. I added some ripples and some rolls into the sides as well to give it all a very fluid feel. All in all, this part of the project was a lot of fun, and I can definitely see myself doing this sort of thing again in the future. Once all the pieces were shaped, I could then spend the better part of a decade and sand it all smooth. I just put on a podcast and then zoned out while I went from 80 grit all the way up to 220, getting it perfectly smooth. Next step was to glue it into place. I slathered on a thin coat and slid it into place and then clamped it to dry. The last piece was added and clamped in as well, and then I could leave it to dry overnight. The next day, I could flush up the top rim at the table saw. I used one of the cutoffs from before against the fence so that the box would ride flat and that I could get a straight cut. And then I snuck up on the perfect fit for the lid, being sure to leave just a little bit of wiggle room for potential wood expansion. Kind of like how I made a new hole in my belt for my gut expansion. Next, I cut out the walnut topper. Once I had both pieces cut to their correct sizes, I could space up the inner piece with some painter's tape and then spread on a thin coat of glue. Then I just lined up and dropped on the top and weighted it down until it had a chance to dry. The next day, I could round over the top edge of the lid and give it a softer appearance and feel. Now it was time for the handle. I started with a couple of chamfers along the bottom edge for your fingertips and then just cut it to length over at the miter saw. Then I resawed some tiny pieces of walnut so that I could continue the theme of dripping chocolate on the handle as well. I used the rotary tool again to shape the pieces, and then I glued one on each side of the handle, and they stuck out past the top of the handle, so I had to trim everything perfectly flush over at the table saw once it had dried. Then I made one more piece to glue onto the top that would connect both of those other pieces. And when this dried, I could use the rotary tool again to shape the edges and make it look like it was all one piece dripping over both sides of the handle. And then with that done, I could center it and glue it onto the lid permanently. Now, in order to visualize things properly, sometimes I need to draw them out on paper. So, when designing the bottom trim for the box, I drew a scale representation and actually traced the router bit so that I'd know what the finished product would look like. First, I started by dimensioning down some walnut stock. From there, it was just one pass with a Roman ogee bit, a couple cuts on the table saw to notch out the top, and then cutting in the curve on the back with a cove bit. To cut the perfect miters for the trim, I chose to use my crosscut sled and the miter sled attachment that I made for it. See, the miter sled is at a perfect 90 degrees, so as long as I cut one half of the joint using one side of it, and the other half using the other, I'll have a perfectly square joint in the end. And when gluing the pieces on, I used wood glue, but also left a tiny spot for some CA glue so that I didn't have to clamp and wait for each piece to dry before moving forward. Vandalizing the bottom of it. and sealing the inside of the box with shellac. Once that dried, I could spread on some black flock adhesive. Then I loaded up my flocker and went crazy blasting that stuff into the box at every angle, making sure that it got a good coating of fibers throughout. And after a full day, I could take off the masking and then tap out any of the flocking that didn't end up sticking. And then it was time for finish. I used a walnut Danish oil so that it would darken up the chocolate as well as accentuate the grain of the box sides. I put on a few coats of this, making sure to get down into all the nooks and crannies. And then, the chocolate cake box was done. Well, what do you think? I just think it turned out awesome. I love how three-dimensional the sides turned out looking and how it really does look like chocolate dripping down the box. The finger joints sure turned out sharp, and the grain of the ash looked so cool once it was highlighted by the walnut oil. Also, I'm really glad I added the trim at the bottom because I think it just completes the overall look of the box and it balances it out pretty well. Overall, I'm super thrilled with how this turned out, and I'm happy that it's going to go to a deserving child in the Beads of Courage program. If you'd like more information regarding the charity, or if you'd like to build a box too, I'll have links in the video description that explain how it all works and different ways that you can contribute. That's it for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Oh, just tore apart my glue bottle. Wow. Stronger than I thought. Oops. Oh, crap. Oh my gosh. I just did this whole step and I didn't even hit record. Oh, man. Oh, that's not gonna work. Well, crap. Jeez. Oh, crap. Good grief. This router bit raised up. Holy cow, look at that. Well, that's scary. Did I just not tighten it down enough? Is it? Yeah. That was my issue. User error.